Hello everyone and welcome to Roundtable, a series which aims to bring politically active young people from all political backgrounds together to discuss varying issues of the day. Today we're talking about CETA, or to give it its full name, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. On Wednesday I was joined by 5 representatives from Ireland's major political parties and youth wings. With me was Ryan Kelly, College's Engagement Officer for the Social Democrats, Art O'Mahony, the International Policy Officer on YFG's International Committee, Liam Gleeson, Ógra Fianna Fáil's Dublin organiser, Dara Adelaida, chairperson of Dublin City University's People Before Profit branch, and Hugh Murphy, Labour Youth International officer. As always, if you'd like to get in contact with the show, you can engage with us on our social media platforms linked below, or you can reach out to us via our business email, johnson.business.yt@gmail.com. With that out of the way, please sit back, relax, and enjoy. Art, I'm going to start with you first of all, because given the case for your youth wing, in this case, your party is the only one here tonight that's heavily in favour of the agreement. And we'll probably be coming back to you at varying points throughout the evening. But first of all, I'd like to know, why is YFG in favour of CETA?
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank you for organising the debate, and I think it's wonderful to see young people across all political spectrums actually debating the nuances and the intricacies of substantive pieces of policy and legislation. I think it's a credit that we're even here this evening discussing it. I guess in terms specifically of CETA, Young Fine Gael positions itself very uniquely on the youth political spectrum as being an organisation that is at its very core pro-European in terms of the European project, and has consistently campaigned in favour of deeper European integration. But not just that, is favours a kind of European model which I would say as a fundamental ethos towards trade and towards outward-looking interaction with the world. And I think when it comes to CETA, what we have seen in the discourse recently enough is people becoming fixated with elements of it. And I have no doubt we are probably going to fixate about one specific element of it again tonight. But it's important to note that political parties have a responsibility to the electorate and to the economy. And the Irish economic model, be it in terms of the employment that arises out of agri-food, out of pharmaceuticals, out of a whole range of different sectors, is underpinned by having a government and having a union that is pro-trade. And this is a model which we can look to throughout the world. And I was actually the person who proposed this in 2017 to be ratified by Young Fine Gael. And I look forward to getting into the ins and outs, but I would suggest that the fundamental reason why we support the agreement is because it's good for jobs, it's good for Ireland, and I have no doubt that in the long term that it will protect Ireland's economic model and our interests.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to kind of follow on from that, and we'll move on to the next person now. Hugh, I want to touch on a basis because Art talked about how a large section of the reason why Fine Gael is in favour of this and Young Fine Gael is in favour of this is for their pro-European stance. Obviously, there's a lot of parties here tonight that are very much pro-European and are still against the CETA agreement. So in response to a call for unity against CETA from Ógra Sinn Féin, the Labour Youth Twitter account described the agreement as one that will hurt workers, the environment, and any chance we have at prospering in a social Europe. Given it's pretty obvious that both the Labour Party and Labour Youth are against CETA, what are the core issues in the agreement that prompted such a response?
Yeah, thanks, Ron. That was a great question. So, first of all, you're absolutely right. The Labour Party and Labour Youth have historically been and still are firmly pro-European parties. We're pro-trade. That's just something I caught on that Art said. And we're also pro-growth, but not growth at any cost. But the main issue that the Labour Party and Labour Youth have with the agreement is the investor court system. So basically, in these kind of trade agreements, the main thing that happens is that huge multinational corporations get a huge amount of power. And so the way things happen is that if a corporation has a complaint, they can make a complaint in terms of the country in which they're investing. So in this case, Canada investing in Europe or Ireland, if the case may be. And basically, the case goes to 3 arbiters. So that's an arbiter agreed by the corporation, one by the home state, and one that's jointly agreed. So first of all, it's a major issue because it functions independently of our own legal system. And if the arbiters judge in favor of the corporation, then the home state can be fined a huge amount of money, which obviously comes at the cost of the taxpayer. So that would be our main issue. So there's a number of concerns. As you mentioned, we've said on our social media in terms of workers' rights, in terms of the environment, and plenty of other issues. But that's not to say that we're anti-trade or anti-growth. The only thing is, it's all great to say that we're pro-growth, but growth at what cost? Certainly, it's our view that it shouldn't be growth at the cost of the environment in any case.
Mm-hmm. And that's an interesting point that you bring up. And I want to kind of touch on this because it's something I also noticed with regards to when researching people for profit's position on this. And it's something that Dara can talk about as well. One of the points touched on by People for Profit in a recent video explaining CETA was that it would allow companies to sue the state if they were to say, let's say, ban oil fracking. But is that entirely true, though, both yourself, Hugh, and Dara? Because if we look at in December last year, Eamon Ryan was on Morning Ireland reiterating that CETA now refers to the Paris Agreement, so that the investor court system couldn't be used to strike down government actions that seek to implement said agreement. Could it not be argued that something like the banning of oil fracking could be implemented as a means of reaching the Paris Agreement targets, therefore making it highly unlikely for a company to have grounds to sue the state? I'll let whichever one of you wishes to respond to this.
I'll come back to that maybe. So yeah, we have been given a lot of assurances that the investment courts won't be used in that manner, that, there'll be certain protection for public policy. But just an example, because, it's not the first investment court to ever exist. Egypt was sued by Veolia, which is the company that runs the Lewis stations. They were sued when they raised the minimum wage, for example. And although Egypt, the government won that case, it cost them millions in fees, legal fees, all that sort of stuff. So there's almost an issue that even if these policies were protected, even if we were able to ratify, a ban on fracked gas, that it would still open us to these lawsuits from, 100, not just oil companies from Canada, but also any American oil companies that have subsidiaries in Canada. So it's almost as if the threat of a lawsuit could also do as much damage as, potentially losing a lawsuit. But the other issue then is that once you sign on to the agreement, there's almost a blank check that what's deemed as unfair or, mistreatment of corporations can then be changed after we've already signed on. So yeah, there's the threat of a lawsuit, even, if it turns out that we're in the right. But also then we don't know how this agreement, it's in the hands of the EU after we sign on to it. So the investment courts in the future could look a lot different than what they are at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Hugh, have you got a similar enough response to that, or?
Yeah, no, absolutely. But just to kind of say clearly, in terms of these kinds of agreements, it's not so much that big corporations have power over policy, so much that they can file complaints and then the states are fined. So, just to be clear, corporations can't dictate policy, but they can make sure that states are fined. And also just to say in terms of the Paris Agreement basically aims for full decarbonization by 2050. And Labour Youth has been, and indeed the Labour Party have been very ambitious in terms of climate targets. But we have to put the emphasis on climate action now. It's not good enough just to put these targets years from now. And so there's still a real risk there that the agreement could stop immediate climate action, which is obviously a big concern for us.
Mm-hmm. But I suppose what I was trying to get at in that point was that with this point being brought forward about, it not being able to be, a company wouldn't see it as a necessary bridge that they'd be able to abuse the CETA agreement in that sense with regards to, say, if it represents the Paris Agreement, so it can't be brought forward. Are you more so, in a sense, worried about how, the wording of it? Is it more so that it may be a bit vague, or what is it around that sort of element that you don't wholly trust from the agreement?
Absolutely, the language is vague. Sorry, Dara, if you want to fire away there.
No, sorry, I wasn't sure who was asking the question. But I think essentially the idea that a corporation can sue the state over public policy in itself is kind of problematic. As I was saying before, even if they don't end up winning the court case, the number of lawsuits that could come in would potentially dictate how governments put forward policy, because any, sane government wouldn't want to be spending millions on settling court fees with hundreds of different American multinationals. So maybe instead they would rather avoid policy that would make major changes to the environment, for example, despite the positive ramifications that it could have for the environment. Do you want to come in?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So just in terms of what Odhrán said, the main concern, we are absolutely of the view that the language is too vague. In fact, there's even academic evidence of this. There's a professor in Maynooth University, John Sweeney, who said that effectively the language of this agreement can basically infringe on our sovereignty as a country. And furthermore, there's actually possibility within the vagueness of the language that it's a real risk, because we're already a country that's so highly dependent on foreign direct investment.
Mm-hmm. I suppose we'll move on a bit more to the side of Ógra Fianna Fáil now, and we'll touch again later on the investment court, which is obviously a very contentious issue for a lot of the parties involved here. First of all, obviously, Liam, your senior party are very much in favour of passing CETA and ratifying it as soon as possible. Ógra Fianna Fáil, though, however, on the other hand, recently called on the government to establish an Oireachtas committee to review CETA, with the Ógra president, Tom Cahill, writing to the government saying, this is an important agreement and we should ensure it is properly scrutinised and reviewed before we agree to it. And then adding, there is also environmental concerns related to the agreement, and these should be explored in full. So that, in a sense, is almost asking for it to be more talked about, for a greater conversation to be had around it. But are Ógra Fianna Fáil opposed to CETA, or are they just sitting on the fence around it now?
I think you kind of did a fairly good summarization of the issue yourself. Really, no, we're not against CETA in its entirely, and really, most of the debates that are happening can be reframed that it's basically all about this investor court. Like, the bulk of CETA has already come into effect since 2017, the removal of customs checks and taxes on trade, giving mutual recognition of qualifications for engineers and architects, and other aspects like that. But for the full treaty to be ratified, the issue at hand is the investor courts. As you rightly said, our president Tom Cahill did write to government, seeking to have this scrutinised more, because like any proper political party or youth political party, there was debate and there was discussion around the CETA, and particularly around the courts. And in this mindset of how a trade deal on this scale and on this size, have such wide impacts, of course it should go. It should be it should have many levels of parliamentary scrutiny. It should go before all committees. There is no particular time rush when it comes to this agreement. So in terms of Ógra Fianna Fáil's position, many aspects of CETA we like trade, we like other aspects outlined. But again, there is genuine concerns when it comes to certain aspects of the treaty, and parliamentary oversight and parliamentary scrutiny is only a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything though in particular, Liam, that Ógra Fianna Fáil is opposed to within the CETA agreement? Because like the statement, at least that they released on social media platforms, is very much not that they didn't release the entire thing, but very much vague in its wording. It says that there's environmental concerns. It doesn't really outline any of those environmental concerns that they may have. Granted, there are a numerous amount of environmental concerns that I'm sure we'll get onto later. But what is it about? What is Ógra Fianna Fáil wanting to be discussed, or what is it that they are, kind of a bit wary about before ratifying the agreement?
Well, it's clear that the main topic of tonight is going to be is the investor courts, and that is the key issue when it comes to the agreement. Looking for more insight, looking for more parliamentary scrutiny, looking for more debate about the investor court. Because as highlighted, nearly everyone here is not anti-trade. Everyone here wants trade between states. We want more economic benefits. Ireland already does 1.35 billion when it comes to trade with Canada already. So by no means are we anti-trade. But again, go back to the core theme of our position. It's that on a treaty at this scale, this large, and which has a massive effect, we believe that particularly with the court system, parliamentary scrutiny and parliamentary procedure is only a good thing to have these ideas debated and have information put forward.
Right. Ryan, I'm going to go on to you now. Obviously, Catherine Murphy talked about the need for a discussion surrounding CETA back in 2016, raising agricultural issues at the time. It's now very much being taken up by Jen Whitmore and Holly Kearns in the current Dáil. Am I right in saying that the main point of contention for the Social Democrats is, again, what's already been mentioned tonight, the investor court system?
Yeah, so I suppose it was very welcome that Catherine was, straight out on this in 2016, and now obviously Jennifer Whitmore, our spokesperson on biodiversity and climate action, has been very vocal on it, as well as Holly Kearns, in terms of the agricultural piece. I suppose with regards to the investor court system, it is, that is a major concern that, companies would have, multinational companies would have the ability to sue national governments. And what our party is proposing now, what the Social Democrats are proposing, we've actually tabled a Dáil motion now. It's on the Dáil order paper, and basically we're calling for three main actions, I suppose. So what we want is a full and proper debate on CETA, and the investor court system mechanism in particular. So that is, to answer your question, a major concern of ours. I think the investor court system will have environmental impacts. It will have impacts on consumer rights, and it will also have impacts on labour rights in terms of workers' rights. So, the second part of our motion then is for all relevant Dáil committees, to be given the opportunity to scrutinise CETA if it falls within their remit, because as commentators have said here, there are many different elements of CETA in terms of its impact. So there are environmental concerns, there are consumer concerns, there are the labour concerns. So it shouldn't just be. I very much commend Obair Fianna Fáil when they've called for this to be scrutinised at an Oireachtas level, namely through the Oireachtas Committee on European Affairs. However, we believe that it should be all relevant Dáil committees to take into account those different aspects of it. So. And we're also calling them for a risk analysis of CETA in an overall sense before any ratification of the ICS provision, is applied. So I think it's really important to know also that they're very much, young Fine Gael, it's kind of disappointing to see them dig their heels in on this, because in many senses, a lot of European countries, including the likes of Germany, have not ratified CETA yet. So in many respects, people are asking, what's the rush? If it's such an important deal, we really need to scrutinise it properly, and we really need to take a hard look at this. And, I think that's been reflected in the concerns within government, So it is disappointing to see young Fine Gael kind of dig their heels in. And, it's kind of disingenuous to label someone who opposes certain aspects of CETA and kind of give this notion that we're kind of anti-Europe or anti-trade or anything. It's absolutely not the case. So I commend, Obair Fianna Fáil's position in calling for it, but I would say that we need to allow all Oireachtas committees to engage in this and to scrutinise it,
Mm-hmm. Ryan, I'll get back to you in a second, but I do want to pass this over to Art now, because it is a very valid question. Obviously, I don't even think half of the EU states have yet ratified CETA. What is the big rush for Ireland to ratify it?
Well, I think as an outward-looking trading nation, Ireland, it's important for Ireland to set an example. But I mean, it's also not the case to say that this legislation hasn't been scrutinised. And I think it's disingenuous to accuse us of attempting to fast track. I mean, Fine Gael has 5 members of the European Parliament who have played a central involvement in scrutinising and looking over this. And it's unfortunate maybe for other political parties on this call who maybe didn't prioritise the European elections in 2019 and perhaps didn't get the same chance to go through this. But what I would say is, and I think there's one or two important clarifications that ought to be made there that have been put out since I spoke last, that an awful lot of the principles in place in CETA are EU principles. I mean, when it comes to investment and investment protection, the vast majority of that falls into matters such as discrimination of produce by nationality, which is very much in tandem with the EU ethos of level playing field, something which we all put on our European hats to assume that the UK would sign up to completely clearly. And all of a sudden now it seems it seems as though we're getting a little bit concerned. I think the principles of CETA are fundamentally sound, and I think we should be confident to preserve level playing field. And the other thing I would say is it's in my own view, and this is my own personal opinion. I'm by no means suggesting that anybody who opposes the ratification of this agreement or the immediate ratification of this agreement is Euro-skeptic or Euro-critical. But I think it is somewhere between naive and disingenuous to suggest that despite all the language in the provisions in regards to legislating in the public interest, that for somehow CETA is going to suspend and jettison the kind of constitutional rights that we have as a nation and as a union to decide on our fiscal policies. And I think the agreement is far more nuanced and deserves a better debate than the kind of suggestions that are being put out that the ratification of this agreement will somehow materially alter our efforts to deal with climate action, protect workers' rights, and protect agriculture into the future. I am firmly of a view that if we were able to have these calls, and if there was a similar enough model in 2008, that an awful lot of the same language would be used to oppose the Lisbon Treaty, and in fact was at the time, with the attempt to suggest that supranational courts would overrule the democratic and fiscal interests of the Irish state. And I think an awful lot of that has been disproven. I'm just, as a young Fine Gaeler, saying that it is slightly double standards to apply the European credentials when it suits. And I think an awful lot of this, in terms of investment, but more holistically in terms of the agreement, is perfectly in line with EU values. And it was in fact the European Union itself who demanded most of these provisions.
Art, I'll just jump in on something though with regards to, you mentioned that, some of the parties here probably didn't prioritize elections for the European Parliament as you may have wanted, but the provision with regards to CETA is that it has to be ratified by every state government. It needs to be scrutinized by every state government. It makes no reference to, MEPs or European Parliament members. While they may put in, a lot of work and hours into making this agreement as best they possibly can, it still needs to go through the national process of every country in the European Parliament. And given, it's a big document, it's 1,500 words long, a large proportion of people, I know I certainly, as much as we're in lockdown, I certainly haven't lost my life to the point where I'm reading 1,500 pages of a document with regards to Canadian trade. But if we could maybe focus on for one moment, a large proportion of the parties, and I would argue engage to say that a large portion of the population would rather that an agreement that is very fundamental to the way in which the EU is going to operate with Canada in the future, and to companies that will be, using Canada, as Dara mentioned, as a gateway towards Europe, such as America, it might be worth, holding off on ratifying for the moment. There's no rush with any of the other countries. It's still going through various courts, say in Germany, France, and Italy. What's to stop us from maybe giving it a bit longer than, say, the month that was given in December, and just, holding off on it, having a look at it, and making sure that everyone is as happy as they possibly can be?
It's a perfectly valid question, and my own personal opinion, and I'm conscious I have to distinguish between my own view, is that I agree. I think that parliamentary legislative scrutiny is always a good thing. Now, I guess where I would come from, the perspective I'm coming from, is that while we most certainly should discuss and argue the merits of the agreement as a whole, I would still wholeheartedly propose and stand by the agreement as a whole. And I think where Young Fine Gael might distinguish itself from our government and coalition colleagues is that we've made that clear. Whereas I'm still not entirely sure as to, after all of this discussion, where our two coalition partners will stand.
Mm-hmm. Has anyone got any sort of points they'd like to jump in on, maybe in relation to Art? Or
well, like one of the reasons why this is all very topical is just that, yet again, the Greens the Green Party doesn't really need to be seen. Sorry, the Green Party, they haven't got used to being in government and, being governed yet, because all of this nearly kicked off because of several Green Party GDs, I know they're not here, so they can't defend themselves, but it's commonly known that a few Green Party TDs had serious reservations when it came to CETA, and of course, it's not the first time this has happened with that government party. But I suppose it's this thing of that I think nearly everyone on this call would probably agree with the principle of there's nothing really wrong with parliamentary scrutiny. There's nothing really wrong with with examining specific point of concerns. Again, I think everyone in this party would agree. Likewise, I'm pretty sure nearly every single one on the call would agree that, of course, free trade is fantastic. Of course, trade deals are what we needed. But again, as been mentioned several times, I don't want to repeat myself, but it's not like this needs to be done within 2 or 3 months, 2 or 3 weeks, or 2 or 3 months. So there are genuine concerns there with certain aspects. Mm-hmm. So I think again, highlighting the difference between Óga Fianna Fáil, and Fianna Fáil, like as a youth wing, we sometimes we do differ from our senior party. Sometimes we agree, and sometimes we don't agree. And at this case, the youth wing of Fianna Fáil, we're saying, we like CETA, we like many aspects, but we do have genuine concerns, and wanting to have more scrutiny over that.
Mm-hmm. Hugh, I think you wanted to jump in there, did you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Just one of the things I wanted to say in terms of the Labour Party position. So the Labour Party is absolutely the same view like Óga Fianna Fáil and like the Social Democrats, that there's it's essential to have parliamentary scrutiny of this deal. But just to kind of raise a concern in terms of the framing of this issue. So Liam's absolutely right. There's many of members of the Green Party disagree on the deal. Nasta Harrigan and Patrick Costello were very vocal in terms of being against it. But just to be clear, in terms of how this issue is framed, it shouldn't be so much about a split in the Green Party, so much as, these are real issues that could really have an impact on people's lives. So, the Labour Party would also be the same view, or Labour Youth rather, as the Social Democrats as Ryan, that it's disappointing that young Fine Gael are digging their heels in. And just to say, in terms of what Art was saying earlier on, that he's absolutely right, that this is in line with European values. But I think that just goes to show that not only is this a national issue for us, an Irish issue, but also a European issue. European law, the European Court of Justice said that the CETA was completely in line with EU law. That just means that it's an issue on a bigger scale, not just that it should be, because Europe says it's good, that we should all agree with it.
Mm-hmm. Dara, I'd like to jump to you for a second, because I'm aware that I didn't fully get your whole party's position, and I kind of lumped you in with a question at the beginning. But I just want to, first of all, know, People for Profit have stated very clearly that they're going to vote against the bill when it comes up in the Dáil. Is there any sort of elements to the bill that could be improved that would then see People for Profit's opinion change in terms of supporting it?
Well, it would have to be the removal of the investment court system. We're not going to support any arrangement that would let international corporations sue the government because of public policy. The other issue, it goes far beyond that. There's essentially you have to put on, every country has to produce a negative list of essentially public services that wouldn't be affected by liberalization or privatization, basically. And we have barely anything on our list. I think our list is less than 1 page long, while Germany's is 25 pages of particular industries that could not be that international corporations would not be able to buy up and compete with. So I mean, there is a danger there that we would be losing a lot of public services to the private sector. And as well as that, 2 of the clauses in the agreement, one of them is called ratchet and the other is standstill. The standstill effect would mean that if we don't sign the agreement, whatever public services are not on the agreement when we sign it, we cannot add any others onto that protected list afterwards. We can't add anything to the negative list. So, and essentially our negative list is empty at the moment. So every single public service could be up for grabs then. The other thing is the ratchet clause, which means that after liberalization, as the agreement says, but privatization happens of public services, we can't then go back. The government is not allowed to go back to buy up those public services or to bring them back into state hands. It has to stay at the same level of liberalization. So I think, for us to pass that motion or supporting CETA, there would have to be a lot of fundamental changes to the way the agreement has been written. So I really don't see that happening I don't see Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil or even the EU going back to change those things. So for the foreseeable future, I see people before profit voting against the CETA agreement.
Mm-hmm. Art, I'm going to come back to you for a bit there, because obviously Dara raises some interesting points with regards to that. Maybe with regards to, if we can touch on a particular sector that has been, point of controversy in the past with regards to EU agreements, whether it be the controversial Mercosur deal or CETA or the TTIP. What is it with regards to, say, CETA that could negatively very much impact the beef industry? Because obviously Fine Gael on a multitude of occasions, and young Fine Gael yourselves, have stated very much that you're pro farmers and you're pro agricultural sector. And I want to bring up, because obviously you mentioned earlier that you were the individual that brought forward the motion along with Kerry YFG back in 2017 at the Gareth Fitzgerald Summer School with regards to the ratification of CETA. So given some of the opposition we've heard in relation to CETA on an agricultural basis, I wanted to bring up a similar motion brought forward at a YFG summer school more recently in 2019, which saw the members of YFG vote to lobby the Fine Gael senior party to vote against the controversial Mercosur deal. Now, in a statement following from that, in response to the then Taoiseach, now Taoiseach Leo Varadkar, the chairman of the YFG Agricultural, Rural and Environmental Subcommittee, Shane Dolphin, said, "In this time of uncertainty and with an increased likelihood of a no-deal Brexit, it is encouraging that the Fine Gael leader recognises the shortcomings of this deal to the already struggling beef industry." Now, I think you and I, Art, can both agree, and I think many can agree on this call, that this statement was made in September, and since September, the beef industry is still struggling. What are the benefits that CETA would bring for these individuals in the beef industry that the Mercosur one didn't?
Well, I guess to distinguish between the two different motions, and I'm sure no different to all other youth wings on the call, we're soberly aware that some of these votes can be quite tight. The one thing I would point out in the context of Mercosur, where the genuine concerns were that while the Irish beef sector quite rightly can stand over itself proudly as being one of the greatest in the world in terms of animal welfare, in terms of grass-fed cattle, and in terms of leading a wonderful agri-food sector which employs thousands upon thousands of people in Ireland. I think the concern with Mercosur was that while we were imposing, in my own view, for important reasons, for the good of the environment, pretty rigorous regulation, that wasn't necessarily entirely guaranteed within the context of Mercosur, where you see vast swathes of the Amazon rainforest being destroyed and a much cheaper produce of beef coming in. By comparison, with regard to CETA, I would say you don't see a very similar rivalry in the context of that particular sector, but also you see a wonderful market to sell into. And I think it's also important to note, and there was a point made earlier on with regard to Canadian firms accessing elements of our public service, that the road goes both ways there, and there are enormous opportunities for in Ireland to access contracts for capital infrastructure projects, among others, in Canada. And I think of all nations, when you look at the economic models of the 27 remaining member states of the European Union, that it is Ireland that should be most looking forward to exploring the totality of relations, as Charlie Haughey, I think, coined that phrase, and maximizing our potential with regard to the economics of it all.
Mm-hmm. I suppose under those circumstances, though, the one, and you do obviously adequately mention that Irish businesses would be given the opportunity to access the Canadian market, and in that turn the American market. But with that being said, I suppose the one big gripe for a lot of people, and it goes back to the investor course, is that only one side can sue a state. The Irish states and various other EU member states cannot sue the Canadian companies or multinationals that come to the country. It only goes one way. Is that not something that worries you?
I think if you look at the framework as a whole, that's not entirely true, because it's also the case that the level of regulatory expectancy that's placed upon these companies with regard to standards in various different sectors, that those are indeed enforceable in law. and those enforcement measures could well lead to sanctions were said companies to attempt to continue to access our markets. So I'm not necessarily convinced by the kind of mantra and narrative that this is a one-way exercise. I very much disagree. I think with CETA, the European Union has actually, in fact, helped to increase the kind of standards and expectations that we place on exporters in Canada, and I think that's a very good thing.
Mm-hmm. Has anyone got any points they'd like to jump in on here in relation to what Art just said? Yeah, Ryan, go ahead.
I just mute myself there. I suppose what kind of one of the things I would emphasize, and I think we do need to emphasize on this particular discussion, is, you know, young Fine Gael are rightly in many respects referring to the economic benefits of CETA. And what I would point to is, you know, the benefits that have already accrued from CETA up until the point of the issues with the investor court system and the issues around the ratchet clause and so on. So CETA has already cut a lot of the red tape in terms of trade deals between the EU and Canada. For example, I think, you know, wasn't it in 2018 alone, there was, I think I have the figure here, was 72.3 billion was traded in goods between Canada and the EU. So I think it's really important to emphasize the point that CETA has had immense economic benefits and can continue to do so, but we just have these immense difficulties in relation to the investor court system and in relation to the ratchet clause, and these need to be addressed. But that's notwithstanding the, you know, great and fantastic economic benefits that have already accrued from CETA. So I just think that's important to note.
Mm-hmm. Hugh, you wanted to jump in there as well.
Yeah, no, just in terms of what Art said in terms of infrastructure, just to kind of take an example, just a hypothetical, you know, the corporation that runs direct provision centers, for example, is called Airmark. It's an American company. But just imagine, for instance, that it was a Canadian company. Could you imagine, you know, it's great now. It's actually happened that the Greens are in government and that they've decided it's due to happen that they're going to abolish direct provision. This is fantastic. But imagine if that had been a Canadian company. So you could say, oh, it's great they're bringing infrastructure. But the awful things that are happening in direct provision centers, you know, the real damage it's doing to communities, to our society as a whole, and then that corporation being able to sue our government, it's completely ineffective. And also just to kind of bear in mind, you know, the kind of the growth related to the trade deal. I mean, growth is a fantastic thing, but bear in mind, growth for who? This is growth for huge multinational corporations. It's not going to be growth for these small businesses or for ordinary folks. So that'd be a big concern of ours.
Mm-hmm. Art, have you? Yeah, sorry, go on there, Art.
Sorry, no. In fairness, to respond directly to that, and I think we are all in agreement on the call in relation to the appalling stain on our society that direct provision is in its current form, and I think that there is a desire in across all political parties to see the necessary reform come in now and introduce a much more humane model. I don't agree that CETA would prevent such a thing from occurring, and I would point to the agreement itself, where I think the words public interest are mentioned, and there is perfect clarity here. And what I would say is I would be concerned that there is an intentional obscuring of the agreement to suggest that a perfect example of what a government would do in terms of public policy and legislation to benefit their country, that an independent court would side with a corporation ahead of the state. I'm not really convinced, and to be honest, I think that might be misleading.
Hugh, would you like to respond to that, or?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So just to be clear in terms of what I'm saying, I'm absolutely not questioning that a government, in any case, will always take decisions in the public interest and legislate in the public interest, and definitely not, well, could be debated on the side of corporations. But just to be clear, in terms of, as I said earlier, in terms of the investment court system, It's not so much that corporations were able to shape policy, so much so that they could sue governments, and then that fines could be issued to governments, and that'll come at the expense of the taxpayer, which is a huge cost.
These are very valid concerns, Art. And I think one thing at least that I'd like to really touch on from tonight again is that, despite all the discussion that we've had around, should it be ratified immediately? Should this be considered? Should that be considered? Art, I think you have to at least admit a bit on your own back foot as well that you said that, legislating this within the public forum, allowing it to be scrutinized is a very important part of this process. And even yourself, I don't know if it's, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but is it not that you're in favor of, maybe giving it that little bit of extra time just to be heavily a bit more scrutinized by both opposition parties and government parties?
I personally agree. I mean, I'm certainly I would recognise Liam's contribution and the recognition of the autonomy of youth wings in Irish politics. I would certainly be of a view that conversations like we're having this evening are incredibly healthy in a democracy, and I think it's quite apparent that most of the parties here, at least on this call, have a relatively similar modus operandi as to the kind of outcome we're looking for. What I would say, though, however, is I'm not convinced that repealing the investment court structure is necessarily a good thing. I think remedial a structural remedy in place for effective breaches of the treaty on the part or the agreement on the part of states is no bad thing. And in fact, it's not something that we are unused to in Ireland. And I mean, you can look at the political discourse in the aftermath of the Brexit referendum in the UK, where elements of the left would have suggested that leaving the single market and customs union was absolutely paramount to ending free movement and ending the level playing field. So you could engage in the kind of market discrimination to protect domestic industry. These are kind of more fundamental and questions in politics that certainly our political parties are mapped differently on, and I think maybe sometimes that's not necessarily recognized.
I want to just touch on one more bit. I'm going to ask Dara on this very much so, but it's regards of, we've talked a lot tonight about, the various, discrepancies that need to be sorted out with CETA, but it should be noted as well that, as Ryan mentioned, a large proportion of these elements of the agreement have been implemented over the course since 2016 and have seen a positive change for both the EU and Canada. With regards to, say, we've talked a lot about, how this might negatively impact workers. Is it not fair to say, and on some cases, I'm going to draw a comparison here to an equally controversial topic around Apple in Ireland. It has created a large proportion of jobs for individuals. Granted, you can argue that the repercussions of them not paying the adequate level of tax that you would expect a corporation of that size to produce, it has led for people on, say, a lower income background to be able to access those sort of individual jobs and properties and whatnot. Is CETA not, in a sense, going to offer more people abilities in these sectors as well, Dara?
Thanks. Well, I'll just say, in the initial part, before CETA any part of it was ratified, People Before Profit was against it. And we're an internationalist party. We're not against international cooperation. We're very much in favor of that. But a lot of these trade agreements don't focus very much on workers and focus a lot on international corporations. As you were saying, yes, sometimes they come, sometimes they provide jobs. They often don't pay enough tax. So, just as an example, of how, these free trade agreements often favor corporations over workers. If you look at the Debenhams workers who have been on strike for nearly a year now, Debenhams essentially offloaded debt from a subsidiary in another country onto their subsidiary in Ireland. And, it's basically a legal loophole so that they didn't have to pay their workers. They ran off with 13 million euro worth of workers' money that should have been paid in redundancies, in unpaid work. So I think, trade agreements, they have a lot of positives, but I think, to be properly for any sort of trade agreement, we need one that focuses more on workers' rights. Like our trade arrangement, I don't think it's an agreement, but with Bangladesh, essentially allows European retailers to go in to pay poverty wages to women there. And then, like what happened at the beginning of the pandemic, they left without paying any of the workers because of the downturn. So we're not in any case against international cooperation, but a lot of these trade agreements, as I was saying, and it's like emblematic of, you know, the whole investor court system. The reason it's there is because the CETA trade agreement is about protecting the rights of international corporations, not the rights of workers.
Mm-hmm. Dara, I want to touch on one other bit, and this could be construed as being completely off from the topic at hand, but it is in relation to people for profit as well. And you did mention that a lot of the time you're in favor of international agreements and working together, so long as it benefits the worker, which is the sort of the main motto around that. But if we cast our minds back to 2016, I and a lot of people have very main recollection of Eamon McCann speaking very much in the Northern Irish Assembly in favor of Brexit. Similar motions that, something that we have now learned has been an extremely detrimental part, not only for European workers, but workers in the UK and in the north of Ireland. Is it more so people for profit's position against CETA is mainly for the element of its, at the end of the day, the EU is by all nature, a capitalist entity. It represents that element. Is it that people for profit are against the CETA agreement because it embodies that element of, or that ideology?
You're kind of on the right track there, but like our position on Brexit was a lot different than what I guess the Conservatives were pushing. Their position was almost ethno-nationalistic. We're not against immigration. We're pro-immigration. We were against, the EU treatment of, allowing authoritarianism to thrive in Hungary and Poland, of the way we were treating migrants coming from Syria. The way we acted with the Libyan government, which is essentially, promoting slavery and trafficking. So, we weren't against. We were pro-Brexit in the sense that we were looking for changes. Because the EU fundamentally is not working in the interest of every worker, even though it is an internationalist organization. It's not working in the interest of the asylum seekers that are coming here. So we're not opposed to CETA because, I'm not saying we're going to oppose every single proposition that the EU comes up with just because it's a capitalist entity. But yes, it it did come up with this trade agreement that overwhelmingly, and the same with TTIP, which we were against at the time, for the exact same reasons. Until, ironically enough, it was because of Donald Trump that's no longer on the cards. But it was the same investment court settlement system. We're against these trade agreements, because they support the rights of international corporations above the worker. So I don't think it's just a coincidence that the EU, that all these trade agreements that they sign don't value the worker over the international corporations. I think that's emblematic of capitalism. I don't think they're non-connected. Mm-hmm. Does that answer your question?
Yes, no, yeah, brilliant. I think Art and Liam, both of your mics unmuted. Liam, do you want to go first?
I suppose, like, some people, you're trying to have your cake and eat it, really. It's like the mindset of some, when it comes to this idea, we love, I like the shiny elements of CETA, but I actually really don't like the negative aspect. But these courts, this isn't something new. This isn't something that was suddenly made up. Like, the unique thing about CETA is it's basically tying. It's nearly centralizing and streamlining the process of these courts, where in previous situations and previous agreements, it would be a mess when it comes to, because undoubtedly legal issues. No, again, like on the scale between the European Union and Canada, on the scale that we're talking about, of course, there's going to be legal disputes. Of course, there's going to be legal issues. So again, you're bringing it back to again, like the youth, Olga's position on this. It would be like by no means are we against trade. Again, it's just specific concerns about Pacific Court having that process, discussed more, because again, there is no rush. It's not like Brexit where there's a countdown where if we miss the deadline, we're going to have a no deal. Again, parliamentary oversight. I don't think anyone will disagree that parliamentary oversight is a bad thing.
Mm-hmm. Art, I think we'll finish on you for our last point now.
Yeah, I just wanted to return to a point that was made earlier, and I suppose it gets back to the core philosophy of the organization that I'm here to represent as well. Is no different to the fact that you cannot redistribute wealth that isn't generated. if your policies are hemorrhaging jobs, then it's very disingenuous to underpin that with a backdrop that you're there to defend workers' rights. The greatest elevation from poverty is, of course, work. And I would point out that the Irish economic model this time around, by comparison to the crisis which we found ourselves in 10 or 11 years ago, has shown that, in fact, in terms of revenue returns and in terms of, by a comparative measure, that we could be in a hell of a lot worse situation. And a lot of that is down to the fact that Ireland has embraced an economic model which is outward looking, which is in favour of trade, and which indeed recognises the contribution which multinationals bring to this country. I am in 2 months' time starting off a job with a great multinational, Johnson & Johnson, and dealing with those lovely people in the HSE and the Department of Health, where we are undergoing one of the greatest, I suppose, one of the greatest things that capitalism has seen in 100 years, which is a market response to a public health crisis. And I think we should never forget that this economy has played around with different methodologies in the past, and establishment politics like this has been jettisoned in neighbouring countries. And it is, I suppose, difficult for me, and it's difficult for Liam at times to come on here and to have to defend either the status quo, or defend the nuances of an awful lot of these agreements. But on the whole, I would say, with regard to CETA and on a more substantive level, that we should be inherently suspicious of sometimes what the alternative is being that is being espoused. But and I'll leave it at that.
I'll have to say, Art, you picked probably the worst time of the evening to bring out the most controversial point. But I believe Dara wants to respond to that, so I'll let you go ahead there, Dara.
Okay, I'll be extremely quick because I know we're about to finish. But just on the point of the public health response from the private sector, we have numerous vaccines now. We have hundreds or at least dozens of facilities in the country that could be producing them, and we're not. We're at, just above or around 2% vaccination. There's many countries in the world that have not received any vaccines throughout Africa, Southeast Asia, South America. So the private sector has fundamentally failed in responding to this pandemic. Just when you brought it up, we have a lot of multinational corporations here with the facilities that could be producing, these vaccines. But because of intellectual property law, which is, fundamentally held up by the EU and the trade agreements that we're in, no one else can actually produce this vaccine. We're letting people die essentially to protect the profits of whoever holds the intellectual property rights. So I think, there is a criticism of capitalism there that we've put human lives on the same level as the corporate profit. So I wouldn't see, the private response to the healthcare crisis as a positive, personally.
All right, well,
I think that might be another episode.
Yeah, I'll definitely have to have you all on at some other stage in the future. But we're going to leave it there. And I'd like to thank you all for joining me this evening. I think we had a very worthwhile discussion, one that was probably, engaged in a lot of ways with regards to the current agreement, which I don't think enough people are, knowledgeable about with regards to the public sphere. And I hope that more people see this video and, come to the realization that this is something that needs to be taken seriously, that people need to look into, and that they need to make their own informed, engaged decisions on. And I hope that all 5 of you here this evening have put your case forward well enough. I know I certainly enjoyed listening to all of you and quizzing you on various topics. And I'm just going to say one other thing as well, and that's thank you so much for joining me this evening. I know a lot of you, despite us being in lockdown, are still very, very busy. So I appreciate all the time you've taken out today. And with that, we'll leave it there.